Hi there. The title I've given for the talk this morning is Lessons from an Ancient Mum. And that's not me. I might be getting older, and certainly when I had my children in my mid-late 30s, I was classed as an older mum. But this woman lived over 3,000 years ago. So I think that classes her as being ancient. But what I want to do today is just to highlight a couple of lessons that we can learn from her life and her example that I think are relevant to each one of us, regardless of whether we're mums or not, today in the 21st century. Her story can be found in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2. And her name was Hannah. And she was married to Elkanah, but she had a problem. And the problem that she had was that she didn't have any children. And in her society, if you were childless, then that was a disgrace. It was a shame, because a woman's value and her worth and her significance was all bound up in having children. And to add to her problem, Elkanah had another wife. In those days, it was acceptable to have more than one. And her name was Peninnah, and she had lots of children. And that made the situation worse for Hannah, because it made her situation obvious. And Peninnah delighted in rubbing it in and making fun of her. And so Hannah had a massive problem. And it was highlighted again because every year the family went together up to Shiloh, which is where the Ark of God was at that time, to worship God and to sacrifice to God. And as part of that, they had a meal following the sacrifice, and everybody got a portion. So Peninnah got a portion for herself and for every single one of her children, but poor old Hannah just got one portion. And although it was the best portion, because her husband really loved her, it just highlighted the situation she was in. And this happened year after year after year. And Hannah was desperate. And we're just going to pick up the story now, and we're going to do a reading from the New Living Translation. So if you haven't got that translation, it might be just an idea if you just listen. And I'm going to read from 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9 to verse 20.
Once, after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli, the priest, was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was deep in anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord, and she made this vow.
O Lord of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime. And as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut.
As she was praying to the Lord, Eli watched her. Seeing her lips moving, but hearing no sound, he thought she'd been drinking. Must you come here drunk? Throw away your wine.
Oh, no, sir, I haven't been drinking wine or anything stronger, but I am very discouraged, and I was pouring out my heart to the Lord. Don't think I am a wicked woman, for I have been praying out of great anguish and sorrow.
In that case, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant the request you have asked of him.
Thank you, sir.
Then she went back and began to eat again, and she was no longer sad. The entire family got up early the next morning and went to worship the Lord once more. Then they returned home to Ramah. When Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for
I asked the Lord for him. Thank you. Hannah was desperate. I don't know if you noticed some of the words in the passage we read, but she was crying bitterly. She was in sorrow. She was discouraged. She was praying out of great anguish and sorrow. And to use the metaphor that Mark used last week, she was in a storm, a huge, massive storm. So what did she do? If you noticed in what we read, what she did was she poured out her heart to God. And God heard and responded. And when I read that verse, it reminded me of another verse, which is in Psalm 62. And it's the second half of verse 8, and it says this: pour out your heart to him, for God is your refuge. And the question I want to ask this morning is, what do we do when we are desperate? What do we do when we are desperate? There are times in our lives when we feel desperate or we're in a storm. Maybe there's somebody here this morning that is desperate for exactly the same reason that Hannah was desperate, in that you long for a child. But there can be a whole host of reasons why we are desperate. What do we do? Do we try and work it out ourselves, or do we pour out our hearts to God as Hannah did? See, maybe you're here this morning and you're not even sure that you believe God exists, much less that he would be interested in what is going on in your life. Maybe you don't normally go to church and you're here this morning because you've come to visit your mom, or maybe you're a mom who's visiting your family and they've brought you along to church. Can I encourage you this morning to give this a go, to pour out your heart to God? Because what have you got to lose? If nothing happens, that just confirms what you already think. But if God hears and responds, then that can transform your life. In my experience, when I've poured out my heart to God, he has always heard and he has always responded. Not necessarily in the way that I wanted or the way that I anticipated, and certainly not in the time frame that I would have preferred. But he has always heard and he has always responded. And it's only sometimes when I look back that I can see that. And very often my circumstances don't change, but I've changed my attitudes, my thoughts, my feelings. So lesson number 1, when we feel desperate, pour out our hearts to God. And the story moves on, and Samuel's born. His name apparently sounds like the Hebrew word for God hears. And Hannah stays at home with Samuel until he is weaned. Now, in their society, weaning was a lot longer a process than it is for us today. But when he was weaned, she takes him to Shiloh. And we're not told how old Samuel was, but I guess he would have been old enough to live independently of his mother. Hannah honoured her promise to God that she would give Samuel back to God so that he would serve God all his life. And she did that. And Samuel became one of the greatest leaders that Israel ever had. But she learnt to let him go. This son who she was so desperate for, that she had prayed so long for, she let him go. But she didn't stop loving him, and she didn't stop caring for him. There's a lovely verse in chapter 2, verse 19. It says this: each year his mother made a small coat for him and brought it to him when she came with her husband for the sacrifice. So she never forgot him. She never stopped caring. She never stopped learning. So the second question that I want to ask this morning is, how good are we at letting go and carrying on caring? How good are we at letting go and carrying on caring? And this is not just about the mother-child relationship. I believe it's about all the relationships we have, all our close relationships. How good are we at letting go and carrying on caring? I had the privilege of seeing this principle modelled by my mother. She had 5 children, and she let us all go to leave home, make our own choices, make our own decisions, and live our lives independently. But she never, ever stopped caring. And for me, I think primarily this is shown of the memory I have of her. Every Sunday afternoon for 15 years, she sat down and wrote a letter to my brother and his wife who were living in Africa. And this was in the 70s and 80s, so we're talking about pre-computers. So there was no email, there was no Skype, there was no Facebook. She sat down and wrote on an airmail form. Now, you would have to be of a certain age to have a visual idea of what an airmail form looks like. But it was something that was in very fine blue paper, which you have to fold up and then lick the edges and fold it in. But every Sunday afternoon for 15 years, she wrote a letter to my brother and his wife. As a consequence of that, every Sunday afternoon, for the last 5 years on and off, I have sat and written an email to our son, who has been travelling and is currently in Canada. And that is a direct result of having seen my mum do that. Now, my son never responds to my email. But woe betide me if I miss or if I'm late. I have to say that I have now come into the 21st century by getting a smartphone just before Christmas. And I have now discovered the delights of WhatsApp, which now means that I can text him and we can phone each other without having to pay. And I've even learned how to send him pictures. So so there is some value in living at this time. Our daughter is married and she lives in London. She left home at 18 to go to university and she has never come back. But this is part of the prayer that I wrote when coming home on the train for my first visit to see her in her first term at university. Teach me how to encourage, to support, to love, to give wise advice without interfering, manipulating, meddling, or pressurizing. Teach me to pray effectively for her and be there when she needs me. Help me not to make demands or have unrealistic expectations. Teach me to show your unconditional love and always point her to you, because you alone can meet her every need. And I'm still learning 10 years on. Letting go and carrying on caring is not an easy thing. Relationships can be incredibly complicated, and it will mean different things for different people in different situations. But in my experience, it's worth the effort because it allows people to grow and develop and take responsibility for their own choices and decisions. It allows them the freedom to love you, not because they should or they ought, but because they want to. And I believe it reflects the heart of God, in that God never, ever gives up loving and caring for us. As we sang the last song, his love never gives up. It never runs out. And I believe that God longs for us to respond to his love with an overwhelming love back. So 2 lessons from an ancient mum. When desperate, pour out your heart to God and let go and carry on caring. Let's just pray. Father, thank you that your love for us is unconditional, that you never stop loving, you never stop caring. And I pray for each one of us, in whatever relationships we're in, that we will learn to reflect that love to each other. In Jesus' name, amen.
Father, thank you that you're always with us. We're going to invite the band back up, and it's customary, isn't it, on our Mother's Day service that we've got a little gift for the ladies. So not just for mothers, but for the ladies. And me and Mark have been doing something a little bit different on the side. We've been having some lessons from David Salisbury, our resident comedy magician. And so we thought we'd try just a little bit of magic before we give out the gifts. And so I don't know if the children are going to be coming back in to help us in a few moments, but just give me a sec because we just need to set something up. This may work really well, or it may go horribly wrong. Someone try and get the kids to come back down because we've got a nice little ornamental box. But if you can...